Picture this. April 12, 1949. The Austrian-German border near Berchtesgaden, where American occupation forces patrol a frontier that separates zones of control and where smugglers, war criminals, and intelligence operatives all conduct business that official channels don't acknowledge. Staff Sergeant Michael Chen, a 26-year-old U.S. Army Ranger from San Francisco assigned to border security operations, radios his patrol base at 14:23 hours, reporting observation of suspicious activity near an abandoned railway station that maps show was destroyed during the war's final weeks. At 14:26 hours, Chen informs his squad leader he's moving closer to investigate, estimating 10 minutes for reconnaissance. At 14:38 hours, when Chen fails to check in as required, his squad deploys to his last known position. They find his radio abandoned beside the station's ruins, its microphone still keyed as if Chen had been about to transmit when something interrupted him. For 76 years, the disappearance of a ranger on what should have been routine patrol duty would remain unexplained, a case that American military police, Austrian authorities, and eventually German investigators would examine without resolution. Until 2025, when construction crews renovating the rail line for high-speed service discover that the station wasn't destroyed in 1945. It was deliberately buried, sealed beneath meters of earth and rubble that concealed intact structures, where Staff Sergeant Chen had discovered something that 3 governments had spent 76 years ensuring stayed hidden from public knowledge and historical record. Michael Chen hadn't planned on a military career. He'd enlisted in 1945 at age 22, motivated by desire to serve the country his immigrant parents had adopted and to prove that Chinese Americans belonged in uniform despite wartime suspicions and discrimination. He'd trained as an infantryman, volunteered for ranger qualification, and been assigned to occupation duty in Austria in 1947 when the Army needed personnel with specialized skills for border security operations. His assignment to the Austrian-German border came during a period of intense smuggling activity and intelligence operations. The border wasn't just a line on maps, it represented the frontier between American and Soviet zones of influence, where refugees fled Soviet-controlled territories seeking asylum in the West, where black marketeers moved goods that official economies couldn't provide, and where Nazi war criminals attempted to reach escape routes that would deliver them to safety in South America or the Middle East. Chen's letters home to his family in San Francisco, preserved by his younger sister Linda and donated to military archives in 2008, documented his frustration with border duty. In March 1949, he'd written, "We patrol the same routes every day, looking for smugglers and refugees. But the real action happens in places we're told not to investigate. Abandoned buildings, old military installations, sections of forest where intelligence claims to be conducting operations but which soldiers like me are ordered to avoid. Sometimes I wonder if our patrols are actually designed to keep us away from things we're not supposed to see rather than to catch people crossing illegally." His final letter, mailed on April 10th, contained observations that Linda would reread obsessively for decades, searching for meaning in her brother's disappearance. "We've been assigned new patrol routes this week, covering areas that were previously off-limits. My squad leader says it's because intelligence operations in the sector have concluded, but I don't believe him. The timing feels wrong, like something's changed that makes it necessary to have regular patrols in areas that used to be deliberately avoided. There's an old railway station on our new route, supposedly destroyed in 1945, but which aerial photographs show is more intact than official records indicate. I'm curious about it, but my orders are to observe and report, not investigate independently. Still, if I see something worth documenting, I'll take the initiative. Sometimes you have to bend rules to do your job properly. The railway station where Chen would vanish had a history that military intelligence files documented extensively. Built in 1938 during Germany's annexation of Austria, it had served as a transit point for military supplies moving between Bavaria and Austria during the war. In the conflict's final weeks, as Allied forces closed in and German authorities evacuated personnel and equipment, the station had been the site of frantic activity that witnesses described as chaotic and purposeful simultaneously. Local Austrian civilians, interviewed by Allied investigators in 1945, reported seeing trains arriving at the station in late April, carrying cargo that was unloaded with military precision despite the general collapse of German organization elsewhere. The cargo had been moved into the station's warehouses and administrative buildings, and then, on April 28, 1945, just days before Germany's surrender, explosions had rocked the area. When civilians emerged from shelters to investigate, the station appeared to be destroyed, its buildings collapsed, its platforms buried under rubble. Allied forces occupying the area in May 1945 had conducted perfunctory inspections of the ruins, finding nothing of intelligence value and determining that the station wasn't strategically important enough to merit reconstruction. The site had been left as it was, gradually being reclaimed by vegetation as nature covered what war had destroyed. By 1949, the station was a landscape feature that maps acknowledged, but which held no apparent significance beyond being a reminder of conflict that had ended 4 years earlier. Chen's patrol on April 12, 1949, had been routine until he'd observed activity near the station ruins that his training told him warranted investigation. His radio transmission at 14:26 hours had been brief and professional. "This is Charlie 7, observing vehicle tracks near grid reference 472893. Recent, possibly within past 24 hours. Moving to investigate. Will report findings in 10 minutes. Over." His squad leader, Sergeant James Walsh, a veteran who'd served through the war's final year, had acknowledged the transmission and noted in his log that Chen's observation was consistent with suspected smuggling activity that intelligence had warned might be occurring in the sector. Walsh had maintained radio watch, expecting Chen's follow-up report at 14:36 hours. When that report didn't come, Walsh had attempted contact at 14:38 hours, receiving no response. By 14:40 hours, Walsh had deployed the rest of the squad to Chen's last known position, concerned but not yet alarmed. Radio failures were common in mountainous terrain, and Chen might simply have moved into a location where transmission was impossible. The squad reached the station ruins at 14:58 hours and immediately found Chen's radio, lying beside what appeared to be a partially cleared path leading into the rubble. The radio was still functioning, its microphone keyed and transmitting static as if Chen had been about to speak when he'd dropped or placed the device. Walsh retrieved the radio and conducted systematic search of the immediate area, finding boot prints that matched Chen's issue boots leading toward and into the ruins, but not emerging. The trail simply ended at a section of collapsed wall that appeared solid, but which closer inspection revealed was a facade concealing an opening behind it. Walsh radioed for backup and authorization to proceed, following protocols that required approval before entering structures that might be unstable or booby-trapped. By the time additional personnel and a military police investigation team arrived at 16:20 hours, 2 hours after Chen's disappearance, the site had been secured, and Walsh had documented everything without disturbing evidence. The military police commander made the decision to enter the concealed opening, and what they found explained why Chen had failed to check in, but raised questions that would remain unanswered for 76 years. The opening led to a descending stairwell, intact and clearly functional despite the apparent destruction of the buildings above it. The station hadn't been destroyed in 1945. It had been deliberately buried, with only the surface structures damaged while everything below ground level remained operational. The stairwell descended 20 meters, ending at a steel door bearing Wehrmacht engineering stamps and warning signs in German indicating restricted access. The door wasn't locked. Its mechanism had been left open, either by Chen or by whoever had accessed the facility before him. Beyond the door was a complex of underground chambers that military engineers would later determine extended beneath the entire station footprint and beyond, connecting to tunnels that reached deep into the mountains separating Austria from Germany. The complex had been designed for long-term occupation, with power generation, water systems, and ventilation that suggested it could support personnel independently of surface infrastructure. But Chen wasn't in the complex. An extensive search conducted over 3 days found no trace of the ranger who'd entered but apparently never emerged. His equipment wasn't there. His body wasn't there. It was as if Staff Sergeant Michael Chen had walked through that steel door and simply ceased to exist in any location that investigators could access or understand. The official investigation concluded in June 1949 with a report that satisfied no one but which offered the only explanation consistent with evidence. Chen had discovered the underground complex, entered to investigate, and encountered persons unknown who'd either captured him or convinced him to leave through an exit that searchers hadn't found. The complex was documented, its contents cataloged, and it was sealed under orders from American intelligence that classified everything related to the site at levels that ensured most personnel involved would never learn what had been found or why it mattered. Chen's family was notified that he was missing in action, that his body hadn't been recovered, and that the circumstances of his disappearance remained under investigation. Linda Chen, who'd worshipped her older brother and who'd planned to join the military herself following his example, spent the rest of her life searching for answers about what had happened on that April day in 1949. She contacted military officials, wrote to congressmen, and hired private investigators. Nothing she learned provided closure, and she died in 2019 still believing that authorities knew more than they'd revealed about her brother's fate. For 76 years, the railway station sat buried beneath Austrian soil, its ruins gradually being absorbed into the landscape as development and modernization transformed the border region from conflict zone to integrated European frontier. The underground complex remained sealed, its existence known only to those few officials who maintained continuity of institutional knowledge about classified facilities from occupation years. And the mystery of Staff Sergeant Michael Chen's disappearance remained one of thousands of unsolved cases from a period when borders were fluid, jurisdictions were unclear, and people vanished for reasons that governments preferred not to explain. In 2024, the European Union approved funding for high-speed rail connections between Munich and Salzburg, with the route passing through the area where the old border station had stood. Archaeological surveys conducted in preparation for construction detected the underground complex in November 2024, and by January 2025, excavation teams had breached the seals that had protected it for 76 years. What they found would finally answer questions about Michael Chen's fate and reveal why a routine border patrol in 1949 had ended with a ranger's disappearance into mysteries that 3 governments had agreed were too sensitive to acknowledge, much less investigate transparently. The excavation teams entering the underground complex in January 2025 found it remarkably well preserved, sealed environment having protected equipment and documents from 76 years of deterioration. The main chamber was approximately 50 meters long and 20 meters wide, its ceiling supported by steel beams showing German engineering stamps dated 1944. But unlike the simple storage facility that surface ruins suggested, this space contained equipment and installations that revealed purposes far more complex than wartime logistics. The first discovery that captured investigators' attention was a communications center occupying one entire wall of the main chamber. Radio equipment, telegraphy systems, and encoding machines far more sophisticated than standard Wehrmacht field units suggested this facility had been designed for high-level secure communications rather than tactical military operations. Technical analysis revealed that this equipment had been designed to operate on frequencies that Allied monitoring hadn't covered because intelligence services hadn't believed such technology existed in 1945. But it was the second chamber, accessed through a steel door marked with warning signs in multiple languages including German, English, and Russian, that provided the first concrete evidence of what had happened to Staff Sergeant Michael Chen. A small office containing a desk, filing cabinets, and living quarters showed signs of occupation by someone who'd been living underground rather than simply working there. And on the desk was a journal, U.S. Army issue, bearing Chen's name and service number stenciled on its cover. The journal began on April 12, 1949, at 14:27 hours, just minutes after Chen had radioed his squad leader about investigating the station. Entered underground facility through concealed passage in ruins. Initial assessment suggests German military construction, probably late war period based on equipment I'm seeing. Attempting to radio out, but signal isn't penetrating. Moving deeper to assess scope before returning to surface to report. The subsequent entries documented Chen's exploration of the complex and his discovery that he wasn't alone in the facility. 1,445 hours. Encountered 3 individuals in main chamber. They identify themselves as Dr. Klaus Hoffmann, German physicist, Dr. Sarah Mitchell, British chemist, and Lieutenant Yuri Petrov, Soviet intelligence officer. They claim to represent what they call the Preservation Initiative, an international scientific program that survived the war by operating outside national control. They've offered to explain the facility's purpose if I agree to listen before making decisions about what to report. Chen's journal revealed that he'd spent hours in conversation with these 3 individuals, learning about a program that challenged everything he'd been taught about how science and intelligence operated. The Preservation Initiative, according to documents Chen summarized in his journal, had been established in 1944 by scientists and intelligence officers from multiple nations who recognized that certain knowledge was too important to be monopolized by any single country or destroyed by fear of its implications. The program focused on what its founders called continuity research, methods of preserving scientific knowledge and technical capabilities across potential civilizational collapses. The atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki in 1945 had convinced the initiative's members that humanity faced existential risks from its own technological development, and they'd dedicated themselves to ensuring that knowledge survived regardless of what wars or disasters might destroy in coming decades. But Chen's journal also documented his growing unease about what the Preservation Initiative represented. April 13th, 02:34 hours. I've been underground 14 hours. Dr. Hoffmann has shown me research they're conducting on information storage, methods of encoding knowledge into materials that survive extreme temperatures and radiation. Dr. Mitchell demonstrated chemical processes that preserve biological samples indefinitely. Lieutenant Petrov explained intelligence networks that operate independently of government control, gathering information that all nations eventually benefit from. Everything they're doing sounds noble. But it also sounds like treason. Like scientists and intelligence officers have decided they're above national loyalty and can operate by their own rules. The journal revealed that Chen had been given a choice similar to what other observers before him had faced: leave, report finding an abandoned facility, and return to normal duty, or remain as American observer, understanding the initiative's work and ensuring it posed no threat to U.S. security while serving as liaison between the program and intelligence handlers who'd be contacted through secure channels. The choice required accepting that his military career would end, that his family would be told he was missing, and that he'd live the rest of his life under constraints that official service never imposed. Chen's journal documented his internal struggle with this decision over 3 days spent underground. April 15th, 16:23 hours. I've asked for time to think. Dr. Hoffmann says I can take a week if needed, that they're not trying to pressure me, but that my decision has implications for whether the facility can continue operating at this location. If I leave and report what I've found, the facility will be seized by whichever nation moves first. Probably the Americans, given our occupation authority. The research will be classified, monopolized, and possibly suppressed if it threatens political interests. If I stay, I become part of something that transcends national service, but which requires me to abandon everything that service has meant to me. The journal's tone shifted on April 16th after Chen had been given access to the facility's archives, documents, and evidence of what the Preservation Initiative had achieved since its establishment. April 16th, 08:47 hours. They've shown me records of knowledge they've preserved. Scientific papers from German, British, American, and Soviet researchers that were supposed to have been destroyed for security reasons, but which the initiative copied and saved. Technical specifications for technologies that governments decided were too dangerous for continued development, but which might save lives if disasters make conventional solutions impossible. Evidence of war crimes and atrocities from all sides that official histories have tried to erase or minimize. This isn't just scientific preservation. It's an archive of truths that powerful people want forgotten. Chen's final journal entry as an independent observer was dated April 18, 1949. I'm staying. Not because I've been coerced or convinced that national loyalty doesn't matter. Because I believe some knowledge is too important to be monopolized or destroyed. I'll serve as American observer, ensuring this facility doesn't threaten U.S. security while it continues work that all nations will eventually benefit from. My family will be told I'm missing. My career is over. But perhaps protecting knowledge that transcends politics is worth the sacrifice of serving a nation that, despite its flaws, I still believe represents principles worth defending. The investigation team found extensive evidence that Chen had indeed lived in the facility for years after his reported disappearance. Personal quarters showing signs of long-term occupation. Letters to his sister Linda that had been written but never mailed, documenting his life underground and his complex feelings about the choice he'd made. And a second journal, covering the period from 1949 to 1955, revealing that Chen had served as one of several national observers stationed at Preservation Initiative facilities across Europe during the early Cold War years. This second journal painted a picture of Chen's daily life as an observer, monitoring research to ensure it didn't threaten security, communicating with CIA handlers through dead drops and encrypted messages, attending meetings with observers from other nations where they discussed how to balance protecting the initiative's independence against preventing it from being exploited by any single government, and wrestling with isolation, guilt about his family, and questions about whether his service to knowledge transcended his oath to country or betrayed it. The journal documented Chen's participation in several crises where the initiative had faced threats. In 1950, when Soviet intelligence attempted to seize a facility in eastern Austria, Chen had coordinated with American and British observers to evacuate researchers and move equipment before KGB officers arrived. In 1952, when McCarthyism created pressures to expose and prosecute Americans involved in international scientific cooperation, Chen had helped draft protocols that protected researchers while maintaining initiative independence. And in 1954, when nuclear weapons testing threatened to contaminate sites where the initiative stored sensitive materials, Chen had worked with observers from all nations to relocate archives to safer locations. But the journal's final entries revealed that Chen's service had come at personal cost that he'd never fully resolved. August 3, 1955. The initiative is closing this facility, consolidating operations at locations where observer presence won't be needed because protocols have been established that all nations trust. I'm being offered reintegration, a new identity, and support to start civilian life somewhere far from intelligence work. I'll become Thomas Wang, Chinese-American engineer who emigrated from Taiwan in 1950. My military service will be fiction designed to explain gaps in my history. Linda will never know I survived. My parents will never learn I chose knowledge over family, and I'll spend whatever years remain trying to justify that choice to myself. The investigation team found documentation of Chen's reintegration in files that the initiative's successors had maintained with bureaucratic precision. He'd lived in San Francisco under his assumed identity from 1956 until his death in 1991 at age 68. He'd worked as a civil engineer, married, had 2 children, and never revealed his actual history to anyone, including his wife. He'd maintained contact with initiative handlers through his entire civilian life, serving as consultant on technical matters when his expertise was needed, but he'd never returned to active observer duty. Most poignantly, the team found letters Chen had written to Linda in the final years of his life, letters that remained sealed because he'd never decided whether to send them. The letters explained what had happened in April 1949, justified his choice to join the Preservation Initiative, and asked forgiveness for pain his disappearance had caused. They documented his life as Thomas Wang, his children and grandchildren who knew him only through his assumed identity, and his enduring guilt about abandoning Michael Chen's family to pursue principles he'd believed were worth any sacrifice. The final letter, dated January 15, 1991, just months before Chen's death, contained words that would haunt everyone who read them. "Linda, if you're reading this, it means I found courage to send it, or that someone discovered these letters after my death and decided you deserved truth regardless of security classifications. I disappeared in 1949 because I found knowledge that transcended national borders and made a choice that I've spent 40 years questioning. I became Thomas Wang and lived a life that our parents would never have recognized as legitimate. But I also helped preserve understanding that all nations eventually benefited from. Whether that justifies abandoning you, abandoning the Chen family name, abandoning everything we were taught about loyalty and honor, I honestly don't know. I chose principles over people, and I've paid for that choice every day since April 1949. The Austrian government's response to the facility's discovery mirrored patterns from previous revelations. The site was classified, contents were cataloged under highest security levels, and diplomatic consultations were held with multiple governments about how to handle evidence of arrangements that none had publicly acknowledged. Eventually, consensus emerged that the facility would be described as a German military installation with historical but not current significance, and that truth about the preservation initiative and Chen's fate would remain classified indefinitely. But Chen's family was contacted, given partial information that authorities determined was both deserved and safe to reveal. In March 2025, Linda Chen's daughter Jessica, who'd grown up hearing stories about her uncle's mysterious disappearance, received notification from the U.S. Army. Staff Sergeant Chen had indeed disappeared in 1949, but not through capture or accident. He'd discovered a classified facility, had remained to serve as observer under circumstances that required his official death, and had lived until 1991 under assumed identity in San Francisco, where he'd died of cancer at age 68. Jessica was given access to some of Chen's letters, the ones he'd written to Linda but never sent, documenting his life as Thomas Wang and his enduring connection to the family he'd abandoned. She was also shown his journals, explaining his choices and the principles he'd believed justified sacrificing personal identity for larger purposes. And she was told, in language carefully crafted to reveal truth without compromising security, that her uncle had served purposes that transcended his military oath, that his sacrifice had contributed to knowledge preservation that benefited all humanity, and that he'd never stopped regretting pain his disappearance had caused, despite believing his choice had been necessary. The railway station, what remained above ground, was demolished completely in July 2025 as part of high-speed rail construction. The underground complex was sealed, its entrance concealed so thoroughly that future construction would find nothing to reveal. A memorial was installed near the original site, acknowledging that Staff Sergeant Michael Chen, U.S. Army Rangers, had disappeared at this location in 1949 and that he'd given his life in service to ideals that military authorities still considered too sensitive to fully explain. But among those few who knew the complete truth, who'd read Chen's journals and understood what the Preservation Initiative represented, there was acknowledgement that Cold War history was more complex than public narratives suggested, that some military personnel had served purposes that transcended national conflict, that knowledge preservation had sometimes required sacrifices that went beyond conventional military service, and that the line between loyalty to nation and loyalty to humanity's collective future had been thinner and more morally complex than anyone comfortable with simple patriotic narratives wanted to acknowledge. Staff Sergeant Michael Chen had walked through a concealed passage on April 12, 1949, and vanished into a world where national duty gave way to principles that transcended borders. He'd spent 6 years as observer protecting research that multiple nations wanted, but none could safely control alone. And he'd emerged into civilian life, carrying secrets that would remain buried for 76 years, before being partially revealed to descendants who struggled to understand why their uncle had chosen knowledge over family, principles over people, and exile over recognition for service that official histories would never acknowledge. The secrets revealed in the Austrian border station weren't crimes, but choices. Not betrayals, but sacrifices made by individuals who believed that preserving human knowledge required commitments that conventional loyalty couldn't accommodate. Whether those commitments were justified, whether Chen's choice to abandon his family for observer duty was ethical, those remained questions without simple answers. But for Jessica Chen and others who learned their relatives' fates, there was at least understanding that disappearance had meant something, that sacrifice had served purpose beyond personal ambition, and that sometimes the greatest service involved giving up everything, including name, family, and recognition, to protect principles that no nation owned but all humanity needed preserved. This story was intense, but this one on the right is even more insane. You won't believe what they uncovered.